"You filthy bitch, defending a thief. You're trash, all of you," Officer Malik Mitchell screamed, launching a kick at the black woman who had just entered the courtroom. What he didn't know was that the woman was Lena Carter, the newly appointed chief of police, sworn in just hours earlier. She didn't come to ask for permission. She came to expose the rotten system he had been manipulating for years. When her name was announced, the entire room froze. Mitchell went pale. His empire of lies collapsed. Lena stood there, her gaze cold as steel, a reminder that true justice never bows. Which state are you living in? And there, do the police protect the people or the power? Courtroom No. 3, Millstone District Court, Wednesday morning. Nothing unusual, unless you were the black teenager standing behind the defendant's bench. No cameras, no reporters, just rows of wooden benches. Pale fluorescent lights reflecting off a pock-marked ceiling, and a tired, flat atmosphere that told you here, verdicts were usually decided long before anyone stepped inside. Locals joked that if you came through those doors in cuffs, there was an 80% chance you'd leave with a conviction, even if no one could remember how long the trial lasted or whether any real legal arguments took place. Today was no exception. The young man in question was black, hair cropped close, face still boyish, tall and thin, trying to keep calm, though his mouth tightened every time his name was mentioned. Aaron Carter, age 17. Charge: theft. Specifically, a watch just expensive enough to make it a felony. No fingerprints, no clear video. Just the testimony of a store clerk with 8 years on the job and a standard-issue 3-paragraph indictment. Reason for arrest, suspicious behavior, and matched initial witness description. The officer leading courtroom security that morning was Malik Mitchell, a seasoned veteran who'd served under 3 different police chiefs without ever getting written up. His uniform was always pressed, the silver badge on his chest faded with time, but his eyes were as sharp and cold as when he first joined the force. Mitchell didn't need to talk, just standing there, feet apart, arms folded. He could silence a room. A young lawyer picking up their phone got an ice-cold stare. A rookie reporter once sat in the wrong chair and was thrown out without explanation. In this courtroom, Mitchell didn't need to hold judicial authority. Real power was making others afraid without speaking. And today he was staring at Aaron with something worse than suspicion, pure contempt. It was the kind of look that didn't require interrogation or evidence. The kind of look that had made many young black men drop their eyes before getting a chance to speak. Mitchell already saw the end. He looked at Aaron like a recurring stain, small, easy to wipe, but showing up so often that he believed society was decaying. In his worldview, skin color itself was a flaw, a social hazard that needed no deeper reasoning. And to Mitchell, the faster the processing, the more peaceful the city. The prosecutor, Richard Ames, was a heavy-set man with a droning tone and sleepy eyes, clearly counting the minutes until he could leave. He didn't need to argue. Everyone was used to the same performance. The accusation, a few distorted biographical details, a weak objection from the defense, and then the verdict. Referring to Aaron, he didn't say teenager or student, but labeled him an individual with prior behavioral incidents within a school setting. The reality? Aaron had been marked late to school 3 times. But in the official narrative, it became a history of repeated disciplinary violations. Minor details were blown out of proportion. Important facts were blurred. Ames read into the mic in a drowsy voice, just enough to make the symbolic charges official. No one objected. The defense attorney seemed to be the only person unsure why she was there. A middle-aged woman with messy hair and trembling hands, she never introduced herself. She asked the court to consider the defendant's cooperation, even though Aaron hadn't been directly questioned. She didn't raise the issue of evidence, didn't challenge the one-sided testimony, didn't mention the lack of clear security footage. She closed with one sentence: "We hope the court sees this as youthful misjudgment, not long-term risk." It wasn't a defense, it was surrender. No one in the gallery looked surprised. This was a courtroom so well rehearsed that everyone saw through it, but no one held the right position to speak up. Mitchell didn't move once until Aaron slightly turned to glance back. Then he stepped forward, placed a hand on the cuffs, and pressed just hard enough to pin Aaron to the bench. Not forceful, just enough to say, "You don't do anything unless I let you." Aaron tensed, swallowing rage. His eyes were red, but no tears fell. From the benches behind, no one spoke. A middle-aged woman shook her head. A young man clutched his phone but didn't record. A well-dressed white couple looked down to avoid eye contact. Everyone was watching, but everyone had learned to stay quiet. Until the rear courtroom door opened, not loudly, just enough to draw attention. A black woman stepped in. Black coat, holding a file. No apologies, no panic. She looked straight at Aaron, and, in her eyes, something made Mitchell turn, as if his instincts had just been split wide open. No one noticed her at first, just a black woman in a black coat, about 1.65 meters tall, hair neatly tied up, bare face, walking with no rush but with clear intent. She entered through the side door, arms holding a thick stack of documents, clipped inside a dark blue folder. No introduction, no permission, no extra sound. She simply walked to the front row, near the lawyers' section, and stood still, as if she had known exactly where she needed to be before even stepping in a place where everyone had learned to tread lightly, speak softly, and ask permission before moving an inch. Her presence was a rupture, a strange silence, in a room filled with rustling paper and interrupted breaths. No one knew who she was. No badge, no lawyer by her side, no indication she was called to testify. But the way she stood straight, eyes forward, she didn't look lost. A few frowned. The notary looked up, then down. A clerk paused, typing. A young officer looked away to avoid eye contact. No one stopped her. No one asked her to leave. Something in the way she stood made people cautious. Not because she was aggressive, but because she was too calm, too resolute. In a room where every head had learned to bow, someone who kept their spine straight and eyes steady was quietly, but clearly, defiant. It said, "I'm not afraid." And in that room, not afraid barely existed. To be unafraid meant untrained in submission, and to not submit meant the power to change the rules. Malik Mitchell noticed, too. He stood near the defendant's box, arms crossed, eyes scanning the room as usual, until something felt off. He turned, saw her. His frown came not from recognition, but confusion. A stranger, not on the witness list. No court badge, no official reason to be here. He walked toward her, slow and deliberate, not growling, not rushing, just a man too used to shrinking others with his presence. A man who'd seen eyes drop before he even spoke. But this time, the woman didn't back off, didn't flinch. Her eyes locked with his, steady, unblinking, unapologetic. And in that fleeting moment, Mitchell, a man who'd manipulated hundreds of courtroom proceedings, felt a chill down his spine because of someone who wasn't afraid of him. "Who do you think you are?" he said, not loud, but loud enough. Some heads turned. No one spoke for her. She set her folder down, calmly opened an envelope and pulled out a paper. She didn't hold it up, didn't wave, didn't speak. She simply held it at her chest and faced the judge, an old man fumbling for his glasses. Mitchell frowned again. He didn't like deliberate silence, especially from someone who wouldn't bow. He moved faster, blocked her view, assumed the same stance he used against street protesters. Feet firm, hand on his belt, gaze firm, ready to suppress. "I asked who you are." His voice colder now, sharp with barely contained authority. She still didn't respond. She stepped half a pace to the side, avoiding contact, not retreating, and kept her eyes on the bench. A small gesture, yet it brought a strange hush over the room. Not because she was being uncooperative, but because she refused to acknowledge the man giving orders in front of her. Mitchell felt the blood rush to his neck. He was losing control. "Get out," he hissed, voice tight, eyes red. "You're not allowed to stand here. This is a courtroom. No summons, no reason. You're disrupting the proceedings." A few people flinched. A chair shifted in the back. A young guard picked up his radio, ready to move, but Mitchell waved him off as if saying, "I've got this." He stepped closer, voice gritted. "Who do you think you are, walking in here like you run the place?" The woman looked up. Light from the side window caught her cheek, showing the tired lines around her eyes. but her gaze stayed clear. For the first time, their eyes fully met. Mitchell was close enough to hear her breath, even light. No fear, no defiance, no provocation, just a gaze of complete clarity. Someone who knew where she was, what she was doing, and didn't need permission to do what was right. Mitchell couldn't stand that silence. To him, silence could be resistance, and resistance had to be dealt with. She didn't speak, didn't back off, didn't look away, and that made him feel undermined. In the world Mitchell had built over 15 years, where one glance from him made people lower their heads, where power was measured by how much fear he could summon, her presence was a blade turned back at him. He reached toward her shoulder, maybe to pull, maybe to push, maybe just to prove he could still touch power without consequence. But before his fingers reached the fabric of her coat, a sudden sound rang out behind him. A chair clattered to the floor. Someone shot up in alarm, and in that exact moment, Mitchell had no idea he was about to deliver a blow that would decide the rest of his life. Mitchell could no longer maintain his outer composure. Lena's silence irritated him, but it was her steady gaze, unbowed, that truly strangled the ego accustomed to commanding. He couldn't stand being ignored by a black woman, without insignia, without explanation, yet daring to stand in court as an equal. The quiet, tense atmosphere bent the manipulative habits he had relied on in hundreds of hearings. And then, in a moment of lost control, Mitchell shouted, regardless of how many were listening, "You bitch! Coming in here to defend this worthless thief! You people are society's trash!" His voice ripped through the room like that of a beast cornered, no longer reasoning, only instinct. The courtroom froze. All eyes turned in unison. No one had expected a high-ranking officer to lose control so publicly. Heads lowered. An elderly woman in the second row covered her mouth. A young man quietly pulled out his phone, but no one dared raise it to film. The air seemed to hold its breath for a second, waiting for the response of the one insulted. Lena didn't blink, but this time she spoke, not loudly, not in argument, but with a voice clear, steady, and free of tremor. "You are insulting someone who has not been convicted." She didn't look at Mitchell, but straight at the judge. "And if this is still a courtroom in any sense, I have the right to demand that such conduct cease." No one responded. She turned slightly, looking at Mitchell for the first time, not to confront, but to remind. "My brother, Aaron Carter, is not yet 18. He has not been sentenced, has no prior record, and has never been heard. You have no right to call him a thief, just as you have no right to call anyone here trash." Her voice wasn't loud, but it echoed like a gavel strike in a village square, each word shaking the invisible order Mitchell had built over the years. And because it was right, it disarmed him more than any counterattack could. Mitchell stepped back half a pace. He didn't know how to respond. The way this woman neither raged, cursed, nor begged was what threw him off. In the system he had once ruled, her reaction had no place in the script. He had never been trained to face principled defiance. The air in the room began to crackle. A young police officer glanced furtively at the judge, awaiting instruction. A court clerk fumbled through files, trying to appear busy. Someone muttered, "What's going on?" but no one answered. The fortress Mitchell once commanded was crumbling, and he knew it. But instead of retreating, he chose the only response power had taught him: suppression. His feet shifted slightly, his hands clenched into fists, then relaxed, then clenched again. The veins in his neck bulged. No one noticed, except Lena. In a flash, she pressed lightly on the file folder beneath her shoe, bracing for what was about to come. Mitchell, who had always issued commands with his mouth, was about to give one with his body. The courtroom's atmosphere began to shift. It was as if a tiny fracture had appeared in the long-standing order, and everyone felt it. The stenographer, usually robotic in transcribing proceedings, hesitated, sweat soaking the collar of his white shirt. The prosecutor on the opposite table lowered his head more slowly than usual, observing Mitchell from the corner of his eye. Some in the audience subtly shifted, not to flee, but to brace for what might erupt. In a matter of seconds, what had been considered a minor trial, straightforward hearing, had transformed into a stage. where raw power now faced a truth that refused to be dismissed. Mitchell stood there, fists tight, breath rapid. He had never been silenced like this, never encountered a gaze like Lena's. It wasn't aggressive, bitter, or meek. It was like a mirror, reflecting him back at himself, revealing everything he had tried to conceal. In his mind, the earlier shouting should have made her afraid, rattled, or at least take a step back. But no, she stood firm. She met his eye, and worse, she spoke the language of law, the very thing he used to shield his abuse of authority. In Lena's eyes, Mitchell was no longer the arbiter of justice, but someone justice had come to collect from. He stepped back, no one noticed. But for Lena, that was enough. She didn't need to overpower him. She only needed him to lose control. Because when a man used to manipulation loses control, he becomes his own evidence. The judge tapped the gavel lightly on the wooden desk, the sound echoing oddly distant and misplaced amid the heavy tension. "Order in the court," he said hoarsely, sounding more like a plea than a command. No one responded. Because what was needed now wasn't the crowd, but the fury swelling inside the trembling officer. Mitchell tried to regain control and failed. His fingers curled, flexed, curled again. His legs moved as if on instinct. He could hear nothing, no defense, no typing, no sound but his own pounding heartbeat. This was no longer a professional reaction. This was pure rage, fed by the loss of dominance, status, and control. Lena stood still, unflinching. Her hands weren't clenched. She merely shifted her foot slightly, grounding herself, like someone who knew a blow was coming but had decided not to flinch. And then, amid the suffocating tension, Mitchell twisted his hip, raised his knee, and kicked without warning. Not in self-defense, not to subdue a knife wielder, but a kick from a beast caught off guard. Enraged at being named, he kicked at Lena, a direct blow, delivered from above, aimed at the chest of a woman who brought nothing but papers and her upright spine. A harsh, dull sound rang out. No one reacted in time. A few gasped, a chair toppled, a soft cry was heard. But above all, there was a terrifying silence, as if the world had just witnessed something that could never be undone, a moment to be remembered not for who survived, but because a system had just revealed its true nature, through the very force it unleashed. Mitchell turned without hesitation. He didn't shout, didn't snarl, didn't bark in order. The kick came like a conditioned reflex, a brutal instinct honed through hundreds of street crackdowns, door-busting arrests, and lessons taught to handcuffed suspects with no cameras around to bear witness. But this time, the kick didn't happen in a dark alley or precinct hallway. It happened in a courtroom, amid the sound of the gavel, amid people sworn to uphold the law, and Mitchell didn't care. To him, it wasn't reckless, it was righteous punishment, a way to teach her a lesson. In his mind, Lena wasn't a woman. She wasn't a citizen. She wasn't someone deserving of respect. She was a loud black bitch barging into a place she didn't belong, acting like she knew the law better than a man who'd enforced it for 20 years. To him, the kick wasn't violence, it was control. It was a declaration. Who really owns this space? The toe of his black boot slammed into Lena's upper chest and shoulder, knocking her back. There was no loud sound, no crack of bone, no scream, but it echoed through the sealed courtroom like a slap. Across the face of justice, Lena lost her balance, fell into the front row. Her folder flew open, pages scattering like gray butterflies beneath the white fluorescence. She groaned, braced herself with one hand, but didn't call for help. Mitchell didn't move. One leg back, hand resting on his gun belt, eyes fixed on her like a predator watching prey drop. No regret, no hesitation, only satisfaction, burning warm like bad whiskey. In his mind, this was order. Real order. Not laws on paper, but fear in people's throats. He thought she'd tremble, cry, and scramble to gather her papers. Maybe someone would call for security, but then everyone would go quiet again. Because this courtroom was still his, and that kick, that was just him reminding everyone. I'm still the law here. He waited for the usual silence, the averted gazes, the complicit quiet he'd cultivated for years, but this time, no one looked at him the same. Some turned away not from fear but revulsion. A few exchanged silent glances. A chair scraped softly across tile. Quiet, but enough to rattle him. Mitchell looked at Lena. She didn't beg. She didn't ask for help. She didn't cry out. She simply gathered her pages, steady and unfazed. Still not silent, still resisting, and it irritated him. The win he thought he had began to erode, not because others reacted, but because the one he'd kicked refused to shrink. He had floored many. They always backed down, but Lena didn't. She had been kicked. She had fallen. But she didn't break. That unsettled him deeply, because if that kick couldn't silence her, then maybe it would be the last one he ever threw in uniform. No one reacted right away. Time stood still. Everyone saw it, every movement, every flick of his leg, but no one moved. The security guard by the main door gripped his belt, fingers brushing the radio, then stopped, not out of doubt, but because no one had trained them for this. A senior officer attacking someone in court, Prosecutor Richard Ames leaned forward, hand half covering his mouth, eyes wide. He said nothing. The judge's hand trembled slightly on the gavel, but he didn't raise it. Not from fear, but from disbelief. He had never imagined needing to strike the bench over something like this, from a man sworn to uphold the law. A gasp slipped from an elderly woman in the third row. "Oh my God," she whispered, then covered her mouth as if she had done something wrong. A little girl clung to her mother, eyes shut, not in pain but in fear. A young man lifted his phone, then lowered it again. No one said a word, no one moved, because that kick and the silence after had stripped Mitchell's badge of every ounce of meaning. The courtroom was no longer a place of justice. It was a crime scene. And in the center of it all, Lena Carter, bruised but not broken, didn't cry, didn't curse, didn't scream. She just picked up her papers, page by page, as if to say, with every move, "I'm still here. I haven't left. And you just made a mistake you can't undo." Mitchell stood there, still breathing hard. But this time he didn't see her as a subordinate. He saw a crack he couldn't fix. And somewhere in that room, someone had begun recording. Lena stood up slowly, one hand bracing against the bench, the other pressed against her side where Mitchell had kicked her. She didn't try to hide the pain, but she didn't let it take over her voice either. Her chest was tight, her breathing still uneven, but her gaze never wavered. With dozens of eyes fixed on her every movement, she didn't flinch, didn't back away. She turned, standing tall at the center of a courtroom, now drowned in stunned silence. No one expected a woman just knocked down by an officer in the middle of court to rise so calmly. No anger, no yelling, no tears. And that more than anything made people stop, not out of pity, but because she remained whole. She looked directly at Mitchell, the man who had landed the kick without anyone daring to stop him. He still stood there, breathing hard, face a mixture of confusion and defiance, but Lena's eyes didn't blink. And then she spoke, her voice low but clear, every word hitting its mark. "If here, inside a courtroom where there are laws, a judge, and a prosecutor, you can act like that." She paused briefly, sweeping her gaze across the room. "Then I wonder, in places without oversight, without cameras, without anyone to intervene, what have you done to those who couldn't defend themselves?" No one answered. No one even breathed heavily. That question wasn't just for Mitchell. It was a mirror, suddenly raised in the middle of the courtroom, reflecting collective silence, conditioned tolerance, and the invisible complicity of those who had looked away when power went unchecked. Some eyes dropped, others turned aside, but no one denied it, because they couldn't. Mitchell clenched his jaw. He didn't respond. Not out of guilt, but because he had no words. That sentence allowed no rebuttal. It wasn't meant to debate, it was meant to clarify. We live in a system that allowed that kick to happen, and everyone here witnessed it in silence. A middle-aged woman dabbed her eyes with a tissue. A court clerk dropped his pen and didn't pick it up. At the back of the room, the judge finally looked directly at Mitchell, visibly annoyed for the first time all morning. Lena didn't move. She didn't shout. She didn't demand anything. And that's exactly why everyone in the room understood. They were no longer just witnessing the trial of a teenager accused of petty theft. They were witnessing a new indictment, one aimed at the system they had once believed was just. What happened next was something Malik Mitchell never saw coming, because he was no longer the only one with power that no one dared challenge. Lena bent down, slowly gathering the scattered papers from the floor, as if every motion had purpose. She wasn't rushed, not distracted by pain, fully present in the moment. Amid the frozen room, she paused at a thin sheet of paper, folded in thirds, stamped in red with a fresh signature. The overhead light caught the ink, still faintly glossy. Lena held the paper up to her chest, facing the judge, and spoke. "My name is Lena Carter, newly appointed Chief of Police for Millstone. The appointment took effect this morning. The original documents are on file with the mayor's office, but this is an emergency certified copy." Her words dropped like a silent verdict, shattering the last remaining assumptions in the room. No one reacted in time. Lena lifted her head, her expression no longer cold, just steady. "And yes," she said, "I have full authority to suspend any officer who abuses their power in public." The room was dead quiet. No one spoke. No one looked at each other. The air, already tense before, now stretched so tight it seemed one small noise might shatter it. Someone dropped a pen. The metallic clang rang out sharp as glass. A court staffer took a deep breath and sat up straighter. A security guard glanced at his colleague, saying nothing, but the look in his eyes had shifted from waiting on Mitchell's command to watching for a new one from someone else. No one looked at Mitchell as a figure of authority anymore. They didn't know what to make of him, only that they couldn't look at him the same way. Someone in the room whispered, "It's really her," but no one followed up. There was no need. Every word that came after would just be a footnote to a moment that had already turned everything upside down. And Mitchell, he stood frozen. Not defiant, not mocking, not dominant. His eyes locked on the paper in Lena's hand, like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. His lips moved, but no words came. He looked around, like a man suddenly thrown from the ship he thought he was steering. But every pair of eyes in the room had turned away. No allies left. He was no longer in control. No one would save him. No nods of silent respect. No invisible shield of fear. And Lena didn't need to do anything more. She didn't flaunt her win. She didn't assert her power. She just stood, breath now steadier, gaze calm, neither triumphant nor threatening. But the entire room understood. The trial had ended. Not the official one, but the one that truly mattered. It ended the moment the woman who was kicked to the ground stood up and said her name. Less than 4 hours after the trial, the video showing Malik Mitchell kicking Lena Carter square in the chest was circulating on every major social media platform. At first, it was just a blurry, shaky recording taken from the back of the courtroom. No zoom, no color correction. But the audio was disturbingly clear. A hissed voice through clenched teeth, "You people are society's trash," captured raw, unfiltered. The way he swung his leg, the moment Lena flew backward, the thud of her body hitting the wooden bench, it was all too real to ignore. No need for clickbait. No commentary. Just one line. 4 hours ago, Lena Carter, the newly appointed police chief, was assaulted by her own officer. And from there the storm began. People didn't just watch. They clipped, they looped, they amplified. The moments of Mitchell glaring, clenching his fist, and launching the kick were slowed down frame by frame. Captions started appearing. "When power loses its mind," "Justice kicked in uniform," "The future police chief," and the officer who kicked her in the chest. But what made Mitchell the epicenter of outrage wasn't just the kick. It was everything he'd said before. On Twitter, an old recording from an internal meeting 3 years ago resurfaced. Mitchell's voice was clear. "I don't need the law. If they won't listen, you kick them until they fear you." That line, paired with the footage of Lena collapsing, triggered an uncontrollable viral wave. Memes exploded. Mitchell mid-kick captioned, "This you," posted next to quotes about community fear long ignored. A new hashtag emerged, "Kick of Shame," spawning a viral trend of dubbed voiceovers, users imitating Mitchell's tone to mock, parody, and condemn. The official Millstone Police Department account quickly became a target. Hundreds of thousands of comments flooded every past post, from missing pet announcements to internal recruitment ads, all spammed with screenshots of the kick and the line, "So who's next on your list?" Other official accounts were relentlessly tagged, demanding statements. From the city mayor to the state police union, Mitchell's name, once whispered in fear by those too afraid to speak up, was now posted openly, alongside nicknames like the Badge Bully, Gun-Toting Garbage, the Face of Lawless Authority. News outlets started digging up old files, past complaints dismissed, internal reports never released, arrests that lasted 3 minutes and ended with "Suspect was resisted." No one believed anymore that Mitchell had simply overreacted. He was now the symbol of something rotten, and no one was willing to let him slip away quietly. But not everyone sided with Lena. As the kick video spread, a group, mostly white suburban residents of Millstone, rallied to defend Mitchell. They didn't deny the incident or excuse kicking an unarmed woman in court, but called it an instinctive reaction by an officer under pressure. In closed groups and far-right forums, the tone turned blatantly racist. If the brother's a thief, the sisters know better. Look at how black folks behave. It says everything about how they're raised. Even white cops have to be scared of them now. Conspiracy theories circulated. Lena had staged the event. She knew she was getting promoted and faked the assault to bring Mitchell down. This is a media trap. How black people reclaim power by playing the victim. A Facebook group named Stand with Officer M was created just 2 days after the trial. In 48 hours, it had over 12,000 members, sharing young photos of Mitchell, posting thank you notes from people he'd once helped during roadside emergencies, and edited clips showing Lena storming into the courtroom, unauthorized, threatening legal order. A video replaying Lena's entrance, titled "When a Politician Pretends to be a Victim," reached over 300,000 views on YouTube. The comments were flooded with outrage over black privilege, claiming Lena had immunity just because she's a black woman. While mainstream media tried to remain neutral, social media had split into two clear fronts, one calling Mitchell an abuser of power, the other praising him as the last man bold enough to speak truth. The pressure from both sides forced the court to make an official decision: suspend the trial of Aaron Carter, Lena's younger brother, accused of theft. The press release cited a brief reason: the trial can no longer guarantee impartiality, following a serious incident involving a legal representative of a witness. No one said outright that the trial was postponed because of the kick, but everyone knew. Once again, justice stepped aside, not for lack of evidence, but because of the overwhelming shadow of a violent act. But unlike before, the story didn't fade. It wasn't reduced to a line in an internal memo or buried in a closed-door meeting. This time, Millstone, a city long numbed to forgotten violence, was forced to confront it publicly, directly, and with no way to turn away. In her first week as police chief, Lena Carter didn't hold a press conference or make a media appearance like most of her predecessors. Instead, she spent every day on the 4th floor, home to internal affairs and the citizen complaint database. The first order she signed wasn't for appointing aides or reshuffling staff. It was a directive to review every case file involving Officer Malik Mitchell from the past 12 years. Less than 48 hours later, a preliminary report landed on her desk: 14 official complaints bearing Mitchell's name, all marked internal suspension. No explanation, no follow-up, no disciplinary files attached. 9 of them had never appeared in any public database. 3 existed only as paper copies, never digitized. 1 was filed under initials, and 1 had vanished entirely. Lena read every line carefully. 8 complaints were from civilians, most from low-income neighborhoods. 3 were from individuals previously arrested. for resisting law enforcement. 2 came from independent lawyers outside the city payroll, and 1, so quiet it hushed the whole office, was filed by a rookie officer, accusing Mitchell of threats and coercion to falsify procedures. That officer requested a transfer soon after, then quit the force entirely. Lena had the complaint timelines cross-hectored against Mitchell's service history and award records. What she found sent a chill down her spine. 11 of the 14 cases aligned perfectly with the same periods Mitchell was praised as Outstanding Officer of the Quarter, or Top Performer in High Crime Areas. The same accolades the local press once celebrated now mirrored the exact times victims came forward and were quietly erased. One complaint stated, "I was forced to sign a confession after being held past office hours with no lawyer present. Mitchell told me if I didn't cooperate, my file would disappear forever." Another came from a 34-year-old single mother. "I was too afraid to testify." He once said, "You want your kid to keep going to school, right?" Simple words, no theatrics, but chilling in their clarity. They exposed a hidden power structure, built not on brute force, but on silence, fear, and the polished sheen of framed awards. Lena personally went to the basement archives, a dusty, near-forgotten space in the precinct. Boxes of paper records sat untouched for years. Some documents had rusted clips, crumbling spines, but they were still there. Handwritten statements, wobbly signatures, faint red stamps from a pre-digital era. The evidence no one wanted to see now lay before the newly appointed chief. No conspiracy, no mystery, just a methodical, quiet system of erasure, where truth didn't need to be distorted, only ignored. Lena didn't feel anger. She felt responsible. Mitchell's name didn't fade on those pages, but now, for the first time in 12 years, he wasn't standing alone. Someone was finally reconnecting the pieces that had been suspended without explanation. As the system began to reveal its old cracks, a seemingly minor detail emerged from a boy with no name in any file. Kevin Simmons, 16, attended the same school as Lena Carter. They weren't close friends, not even acquaintances, but on that morning, Kevin had been riding his bike past the market on his way back from the library when he witnessed something he couldn't forget. James Brooks, an elderly man known to sit at the bus stop near the market, was robbed of his watch right before Kevin's eyes. Kevin was about to shout when he saw another young man burst from behind on a bike, chasing the thief. Minutes later, that same young man, Aaron, returned, breathless, and handed the watch back to Mr. Brooks. But when the police arrived, they didn't ask who the victim was. They didn't ask who had chased the thief. All they saw was a sweating black teenager in a gray t-shirt standing near an elderly man and a stolen item. The cuffs clicked on Aaron's wrists, as if they were always part of the plan. Kevin saw it all, but said nothing, partly from fear, partly from believing adults would sort it out. He went home, told no one, wrote nothing, just let the memory loop in his head like a film with no ending, until he saw the video of Lena being kicked and learned she was Aaron's sister. Only then did he quietly ask his homeroom teacher, "If I saw something important and nobody's asked me, can I still say it?" The first meeting between Lena and Kevin took place in a small break room at school. No cameras, no pressure. Kevin recounted everything in detail: the robber's shirt color, the scar on his left neck, his height, shorter than Aaron, and how Aaron had chased him, not robbed anyone. He even remembered a produce shop nearby with a security camera run by a Chinese family who kept it running due to repeated thefts. Lena wrote everything down. She didn't praise him, didn't pat his back. She simply said, "You just gave my brother a chance to be treated by the law the way he should have been from the start." Kevin's statement was immediately filed into a new report. Lena ordered a scan of area surveillance, especially footage covering the bus stop and the suspect's escape route. But one issue remained. Security footage only lasted 7 days unless flagged for backup. 9 days had already passed. Yet, with help from her new team and an unexpected ally in the shop owner, who had saved the video just in case, saw someone chasing someone, a blurry but usable recording was recovered. In it, a short black man in a dark hoodie with a neck tattoo is seen snatching something from Mr. Brooks. Seconds later, Aaron Carter appears on his bike, in pursuit. The final shot, Aaron returning the watch. No theft, no evasion, no guilt. There was a time when the name Malik Mitchell was an unspoken symbol of stability in Millstone, not the kind of stability that comes from real safety, but the kind built on fear and conditioned acceptance. Mitchell wasn't sharp or particularly strategic, and he certainly wasn't an inspiring leader, but he had one quality every system craves: the ability to act without hesitation. For over a decade, he never stood out for investigative skill, but he was a familiar face in headlines about quick arrests, efficient takedowns, and restoring order in troubled neighborhoods. He had shaken hands with 3 different mayors and appeared in a local documentary series, Inside the Force, where he spoke proudly about neutralizing threats before they can cause harm. And he believed speed was justice, that slowness was weakness, that thoroughness meant softness, and to him, being forceful and fast was what made criminals back down. Every report with his name on it was concise. Suspect identified at scene, appropriate force applied, no significant civilian harm. No one asked further. No one dug deeper. The lack of scrutiny was disguised as field experience. Complaints against him always coincided with his commendations. Grievances were quietly filed away in a system labeled internally resolved. To many, Malik Mitchell was the only one brave enough to enter alleyways that younger officers avoided. He knew when to fake a gunshot, when to use force that left no marks, and he reaped the benefits, not just bonuses, but authority. His words carried weight. His stare silenced rooms. His presence made whole blocks go quiet. Then came the incident at the market, a frantic call about a stolen watch. Mitchell arrived in under 2 minutes. The scene was familiar. An old man, pale-faced, a sweaty black teenager, the watch in the younger one's hand. He didn't need more data, no questions, no confirmation. In his mind, every detail aligned with the instincts he'd spent years feeding with bias. Black, gray t-shirt, right place, right time, enough reason. Aaron's wrist was twisted, his face scraped with dirt from the sidewalk. Mitchell never heard him speak because he never let him. By the time his superior arrived, Mitchell had already completed the preliminary report. Suspect apprehended at scene, attempted to flee. A textbook entry. Clean. Justified. That night he got a text from his supervisor. Good work. By morning, he was being nominated for internal recognition. He felt no worry, no doubt. Everything was going according to the rhythm he'd followed for more than a decade. One arrest, one news blurb, one more line on his record. Aaron Carter wasn't a person to him, just a subject in the system, another statistic. And what pleased Mitchell most was the belief that no one could break that cycle. At first, he didn't think much of the name Lena Carter, just another new face. A black woman in black clothes holding a fat folder. He had seen hundreds like her, journalists, civil workers, defendants' relatives, who always left after shouting a few lines about justice and the system. In his mind, Lena would be the same. Another girl, too confident, thinking she understood the law, was destined to crash when she realized that in Millstone the law belonged to men like him. She walked into the courtroom like an ordinary woman, but stood like she knew exactly what was coming. It was her eyes that bothered him. They didn't blink, didn't rage, didn't plead. They didn't ask permission, and that made him want to crush her. Then he found out she was Aaron Carter's sister, and it felt like blood rushed backward up his throat. Not out of fear. He hated the coincidence. Hated that a black kid getting arrested happened to have a relative smart enough to step inside the system. He hated when people suddenly had a voice without earning it the way he had. To him, Lena wasn't a threat because she was right. She wasn't just a victim's relative. She was a title, a position, something he believed only belonged to people like him. White, hard-spoken, steady-handed. When she spoke against him in court, he didn't feel fear. He felt rage. Rage that the rules he'd lived by for years, who speaks, who stays silent, who bows, suddenly didn't apply to this woman. He thought that raising his voice would bring back the usual silence. But Lena didn't stay silent. She stood after being kicked, looked him straight in the eye as if that very kick had exposed his true position, a man out of control, no longer worthy of representing justice. In the days that followed, he didn't sleep through a single night. His name was all over the internet. Quotes from his old interviews became memes, accusations, and call-outs. The way people looked at him at the station changed. They no longer greeted him with respect. They looked at him like they were deciding whose side to be on. What he feared most wasn't losing his job. It was losing control over the atmosphere. Before, when he walked into a room, everything paused. Now, the space only shrank slightly. Not out of respect, but out of tension. He still had his badge, but Lena somehow had turned that badge into a question. Does this man still deserve to represent us? And what he couldn't admit to anyone, not even to himself, was that Lena never had to threaten him. She wasn't out for revenge. She was simply the one who asked the question he had no answer for. And for someone who had grown used to never being questioned, that was the most dangerous thing of all. That day, the courtroom didn't look like any previous hearing. Every seat was filled before the session began. Outside, local reporters, law students, and residents from neighborhoods where Aaron Carter's case had gone viral stood waiting. But the one at the center of everyone's attention was a boy, 17-year-old Aaron, his hands still slightly trembling as he stepped onto the witness stand. Dressed in a plain white shirt, his face was thin, but his eyes no longer lowered the way they had in those early days after his arrest. He knew today would be the first time he got to speak a full sentence, without being cut off, without being judged the moment he was seen. And the person who made that possible was his sister, Lena Carter, the same woman who had once been kicked down in this very room, now standing in it to protect justice. Lena didn't sit with the prosecution or approach as the defense attorney. She stood at the back in what court staff called the neutral zone. Yet on that day, her silence and resolve spoke louder than any legal argument. The case file was complete. Security footage from the vegetable shop captured a short black man in a dark hoodie snatching a watch from Mr. James Brooks before fleeing. Then, it showed Aaron riding his bike after the thief, retrieving the item and returning to hand it. The footage was blurry, but unmistakable. The thief had a tattoo behind his left ear. Aaron didn't. The person returning the stolen item was Aaron, not the one who had taken it. These seemingly simple facts had been ignored, wiped from the initial report for one reason. He was a black boy in a gray t-shirt, standing near a crime scene not yet investigated. Mr. James Brooks, the elderly man in the video, was also present in court. When asked if he could confirm Aaron was the one who returned the watch, he answered, "Clearly, it was him. I remember him bowing his head and apologizing for not catching the thief. It wasn't a lawyer's argument. It wasn't written evidence. It was a victim's direct confirmation, something no one had bothered to ask when Aaron was first arrested. After him came Kevin Simmons, 16, Aaron's classmate. His hands shook, but he clearly recalled the events. Seeing the theft, watching Aaron chase the thief, then seeing him hand back the watch only to be handcuffed moments later. I didn't speak up earlier because I thought the adults would figure it out. Kevin lowered his head. A long second of silence spread through the room, an unspoken indictment of a system too quick to accept a flawed narrative. The person who submitted the footage was a representative of the Millstone Police Department. But everyone knew, if Lena hadn't been the one to demand it, if she hadn't gone door to door, store to store, it would have been lost like so many others. Now, in front of a city that had once turned its back, the truth no longer belonged only to those in power. It stood at the witness stand as an undeniable fact. And for the first time in months of being labeled a suspect, Aaron Carter's name was finally called out, accurately, without additions, without erasure. The air in the courtroom held quiet applause, not explosive, not chaotic, but enough to feel that everyone had just witnessed something rare, the truth winning. Aaron Carter, a teenager once misjudged for his skin color and being in the wrong place, was now seen for who he truly was. He stepped down from the stand no longer as an accused, but as someone reclaiming his right to exist in society without suspicion. Lena didn't smile. She only nodded gently when her brother looked at her. For her, this wasn't a triumph. It was the final duty of a sister. and the first step of someone now in a position of power. Aaron was finally cleared and freed after the final ruling. But as the sounds of the courtroom faded and the door closed behind her, Lena sensed something strange. It wasn't sound, it was a look. Not everyone gives it off, but she had learned to detect it back when she worked internal affairs on misconduct cases. In the third-floor hallway near the emergency stairwell window, Mitchell stood. He wasn't there to cause chaos. He didn't interrupt or speak out in court. He just stood there, in a dull gray coat, hands in his pockets, chin slightly lowered, but eyes fixed on Lena's back. It wasn't regret, it wasn't pain. It was the gaze of someone watching his fortress crumble and quietly calculating how to rebuild it from the rubble. He curled his lip, not a smile, but the faint twitch of a man used to holding power without challenge. A man standing beside Mitchell, maybe an old colleague, maybe someone from the system, paused mid-step when he heard Mitchell mutter, not loud, but clear enough, "You think you've won?" Wrong. The war is just beginning. He didn't look at the man next to him. He was speaking to himself, or to anyone brave enough to listen. The morning after the hearing, Lena left headquarters. Later than usual. She had stayed behind, reviewing files alone until nearly 7 p.m., not out of fear, but with the understanding that from today on, there would be no room for complacency. The southern stretch of Millstone Street leading to her neighborhood wasn't long, just over a kilometer, with a few shuttered shops and empty parking lots scattered along the sides. She had often walked home after work as a way to shake off the weight of the day, but tonight, something felt off, quieter, still in a way that tensed her senses, as if something waited ahead or followed behind. South Millstone at night always carried a false calm, rows of low buildings under dim yellow lights, the auto repair shop shut since 6, faint kitchen lights behind a few windows, the smell of cooking oil and cigarettes drifting from the third-floor apartment across the street. Lena knew every crack in the pavement, every damp wall, even the clinking of metal from an old billboard at the end of the block. This was the street she chose to remind herself. No office chair was worth more than knowing the ground she stood on. But tonight, the air had shifted, and she noticed it by the 7th step after turning away from the precinct. A motorcycle's growl, distant at first, like a pipe echo, suddenly snarled closer, hugging the curb. A sharp engine rev. 3 figures, hooded, faces hidden, emerged from the shadows of an abandoned gas station wall. They carried no machetes or guns, but Lena saw the thick gloves, the confident strides. Men used to hitting people. The one in the middle bore a snake tattoo coiled around his left wrist, his eyes flashing with the predator's instinct when she froze. No verbal threats, no shouting, just rapidly closing space, as if all they needed was a pretense to disguise the attack as a warning. Lena didn't run, mistake number 1 in every close combat training. She stepped back twice, eyes scanning fast. Right alley, tall dumpster, a leaning fence behind the repair shop. She had once used that path to lead a child out of a gunfight. Memories weren't for nostalgia, they were for survival. She turned, swept her leg, and knocked over the dumpster, heels skidding on damp concrete. The crash of metal startled them for half a beat, just enough for her to slip through the fence's gap. The iron spikes caught her coat, but didn't stop her. Within 2 minutes, she had vanished behind the factory row, as if she'd never been there. Her phone was still in her hand. No call yet, no immediate report. She didn't want anyone but the most trusted to hear of this first. Once safe, Lena reported the incident. The rapid response team arrived 15 minutes later, but the attackers were gone. They had stolen nothing, said nothing, and only a dropped burner phone remained near a tree. Technical analysis revealed a junk SIM card and a few unsent messages. No sender listed, but one message stood out. Friday, after 9 p.m., 8th Street. No car. Prefers walking. Always on the left side of the road. Every line described Lena as a target under long-term surveillance. Digital traces pointed to an old name, Carver, a former part-time security aide to Mitchell during community security events. The phrasing, timing, and clipped style in the texts mirrored the tactical briefs Mitchell once used in civil control operations. No direct proof linked him, but Lena knew. She didn't need his signature. Mitchell was still out there, not as an officer, but as someone who knew the system's blind spots and habits better than anyone. He didn't need to kill her. He just needed to remind her to be afraid, to push her back into defense, too busy surviving to keep pressing forward. Lena stared at the message, the street, then her shadow under the streetlight. She had once believed she'd left this place behind, but now she understood. The battlefield was never the courtroom or the office. It was every alley someone assumed no one would return to. She raised her phone and dialed the Inspector General's internal line. Her voice didn't shake, but it had lost all lightness. "I want to reopen all complaints involving possible retaliation in the last 8 years. Start with anyone who served under Malik Mitchell." The 2017 file was buried at the bottom of a metal drawer, labeled "Resisting an Officer, Resolved." Only one name was tied to the report: Darius Cole. No video, no third-party witnesses. A brief report read, "Subject resisted during traffic stop, refused ID check, used foul language, required officers to use restraint." At the bottom, the familiar stiff signature, Malik Mitchell. But when Lena checked hospital records, she found Darius had been admitted that same night with 3 broken teeth, a 20-centimeter bruise across his chest, and a deep scrape on his knee, exactly where a police baton would leave marks. She didn't summon Darius to HQ. She went to the shelter complex where he'd lived in near invisibility since his conviction. Darius stepped out, his face no longer whole. His crooked teeth made it hard to speak, but when Lena asked, "Did you really resist?" he only let out a raspy laugh. "You're the first to ask that in 7 years. The rest just made me sigh." Lena officially reopened the case. Within hours, notices were sent to 8 officers who had shared shifts with Mitchell that year. Those listed in the report as confirming no misconduct observed. At first, they stayed calm. A few acted surprised. But by the second round of questioning, the cracks began. Darius's file was the first stone dropped into still water. Because if he was being reinvestigated, anyone who covered, who ticked the right boxes in old reports, who signed blindly for the sake of performance scores, was now vulnerable. Lena didn't speak harshly, but the way she questioned, precise, unwavering, left no one certain of their footing. Someone raised their voice in the meeting room. "You're willing to wreck the whole team over one old case?" But another officer quietly closed their folder and exited without a word. And then it happened. The one thing every task force dreads: fracture. 2 officers requested extended leave, citing personal stress. One asked for a transfer. 2 others started texting around, asking, "How deep is she digging?" Suspicion spread like a virus. Every glance in the canteen, every casual check, and now felt like a test. Who still stood with Mitchell? Who was silent to survive? And who was starting to fear the very things they'd once done? Lena didn't need answers right away. She knew cracks in a wall don't begin with punches. They begin with the first line someone dares to see. Now, that line was widening, and those who once felt safe in the shadow of power were beginning to shiver under the light now streaming in. No one knew who'd be called next, but everyone knew this was no longer an investigation. This was the start of unmasking. Her name was Lorraine Wexley, a resident of a small home on the west side of Millstone, a neighborhood once listed as a special intervention zone, but never actually funded for any real renewal. She wasn't well known, wasn't online, and didn't use a smartphone. She used to work part-time as a janitor at a high school, later becoming an hourly in-home caregiver. When Lena traced Lorraine's old complaint, filed in 2013, she found it wasn't just internally suspended. The original document had been marked missing during the precinct's digital data migration. In the system, only a vague note remained. Uncooperative mother, no objective evidence. But when Lena visited her home, Lorraine needed no prompting. She remembered every detail. It had happened when her son, Isaiah, 15, was waiting at a bus stop with friends. A nearby fight broke out, police were called, and Malik Mitchell was the first to arrive. Isaiah wasn't involved, But when officers ordered everyone to get down, Isaiah stood and asked, "Why? I didn't do anything." That question, Lorraine said, was all it took. Mitchell shoved the boy to the ground, twisted his arms behind his back, and pinned his head to the searing pavement on a June afternoon. By the time Lorraine got a call saying her son had been arrested for obstructing an officer, he had a bloody lip, a torn shirt, and bruises around both wrists. She rushed to the station, brought a medical report, filed a formal complaint, and even met with the unit commander. And then, nothing. No calls, no follow-up, no apology. "You know," Lorraine told Lena, "I didn't need a lawsuit. I just needed someone, anyone, to call and say, 'We'll look into it.' Just that. One sentence. But they stayed quiet, and over time I realized that silence was the answer." She explained how after that incident, Isaiah never returned to his zoned school. He transferred, became quiet, withdrawn, quit basketball, a sport he once loved. He didn't grow bitter. He just learned one thing: don't react. Lena didn't take notes. She only watched the mother's hands tremble, hands that once carried complaint forms from door to door, then quietly folded them into a kitchen drawer because I still had a night shift to work, still had to raise him. After the conversation, Lena returned to the station and asked the archives to recover the lost 2013 file. A senior technician handed her an old hard drive on which a record for Lorraine Wexley labeled "Unofficial Complaint, No Witnesses Confirmed." But digging deeper, Lena found the original scan, a photo of Isaiah's wrists, bruised in the shape of standard-issue cuffs, and a handwritten note from a PP teacher. "I saw Isaiah being taken away without showing any aggression." That letter was never included in any formal case file. Mitchell had already filed a same-day report. Subject displayed disorderly behavior, refused to comply, and the system believed the signature on the report. Not the mother, not the boy, not the teacher. Only the man who got to write the story first. Lena pushed back from the desk, paused in silence, then updated the case status, reopened for internal investigation, request to verify past misconduct. She knew no one would be arrested from this alone, but for the first time in over a decade, someone had written the name Lorraine Wexley without attaching the words "insufficient evidence." To Lena, every buried complaint was a stolen story, and every stolen story raised a generation that no longer believed in justice, because justice had once turned its back on them. But if she could drag those stories back into the light, maybe that belief wasn't truly gone. Maybe it was just waiting for someone patient enough to call each name back into the record. Ever since Lena began publicly reopening sealed files, anonymous envelopes started showing up. First one, then 3, then 5. None listed a return address, just printed sheets with short, cold warnings. You're turning over what was never meant to be touched. Protect your reputation, you live. Protect the truth, sometimes you disappear. One envelope contained only a single photograph, a shot of her apartment, taken from across the street at night, through an uncovered window. No note, no words. But Lena understood exactly what it meant. Someone wanted her to know she was being watched. They didn't need to show their faces. Mitchell didn't need to sign anything. There was no need for open opposition. The filth left behind by those who had once thrived with him or profited from his presence was now seeping out in other forms. Rumors spread that she was using the title of police chief for political gain. Anonymous emails accused her of having a personal relationship with a prosecutor, someone she had never even met outside of work. A hidden post on an internal law enforcement forum quickly went viral, falsely claiming that Lena once cast a blank vote in a neighborhood task force budget meeting, causing officers pay cuts. None of it was verified, but it was enough to stir suspicion, and sometimes suspicion is more dangerous than a direct attack. That night, just one day before she planned to publicly release the preliminary investigation report, Lena sat alone in her office. The blinds were open, the lights were on, no curtains, no cover. If someone was watching, she wanted them to see. She was still there. Her desk was a battlefield. Mitchell's case file, logs of suspended incidents, copies of unsigned witness reports, a thank you letter from Lorraine Wexley, and Kevin Simmons' testimony report. All of it lay out in front of her, and she was the only one still standing. A junior officer knocked and handed her another envelope, this one containing a photocopy of her birth certificate, a red slash across it, and a note scrawled, "Whose child are you?" to put a man like Mitchell on trial. No return address, just a faint office printer stamp. She set the envelope aside. Burning it wasn't an option. Silence is even less so. Lena turned to her screen, opened the folder titled First Round Release, clicked Save, and printed. One by one, the pages rolled out. Each one a piece of evidence once discarded, each statement once deemed unreliable. She compiled the file, sealed it with a label, Preliminary Investigation Report, Public Release. By morning, it would be delivered to newspapers, the mayor's office, federal oversight boards, and, most importantly, posted on the digital bulletin of the Millstone Police Department. No press conference, no grand speech, just one simple act. Let everyone see. She didn't expect applause. She didn't hope to be called a hero. But if even one person who had once been silenced saw their name in that report and realized, I wasn't crazy, I wasn't alone, then for Lena, that would be enough. She wasn't tearing down the system, she was giving it a chance to look at itself. If it chose to resist, to defend the wrong, then at least everyone would have to show their faith. Lena left the office just before midnight. The hallways were empty. But she knew darkness had never been the problem. The problem was the people who had grown used to living in it, now forced to face the light. And she was the one holding that light, not because anyone asked her to, but now no one could stop her. The press room that day was packed, not because reporters were lured by glossy invitations, but because everyone wanted to see what would happen when a police chief, herself a victim of official violence, announced she would make public an entire system of misconduct that had long been buried. In front of the podium was a large screen. No flags, no banners, no sound effects. Lena stepped out holding a nearly 70-page document, Preliminary Report on Data Manipulation and Abuse of Authority in Law Enforcement, Millstone 1999-2022. But it wasn't the words that made the room tense. It was the data map behind her, projected the moment she began to speak. The map was a satellite image of Millstone, divided by residential zones. Red dots appeared across it, each marking a documented arrest over the past 20 years. At first, the dots were scattered, then rapidly spread like ink on paper. But what stunned the room was the density in the east and south ends of the city, where people of color made up 82% of the population. Lena zoomed in on one cluster, Zone 7, 241 arrests in 4 years, 196 of them labeled as potential public order threats, over 89% being people of color or immigrant background. On screen, a side panel lit up. Primary Arresting Officer, Malik Mitchell, 37 cases. Beneath that, a line graph tracked Mitchell's arrest activity against the timeline of his internal commendations. Lena didn't have to explain much. The data spoke for itself. On the same screen, an algorithm revealed a startling overlap. On average, for every 6 arrests Mitchell made, 1 complaint was filed, and not a single one resulted in a disciplinary hearing. Lena then quietly presented another piece of evidence, an internal audio recording from a closed-door meeting in 2014, where an officer was heard saying, "We let Mitchell do it because he knows how to clean up trash, and trash doesn't need protecting." That sentence, played out loud in a press hall, dropped like a weight. No one could argue. No one could pretend not to understand its meaning. "We used to believe order was something maintained through numbers," Lena said, her voice not loud but unwavering. "But when numbers become a tool to conceal bias, to legitimize violence, to reward wrongdoing, they stop being data, they become weapons." All eyes turned to the screen behind her, where arrests were color-coded, red for excessive force, yellow for internal complaints, black for cases that vanished from the system. And at the center of it all was a glaring label, Mitchell, Zone of Manipulation. Lena didn't end her speech with a promise. She ended it with a question. If that kick hadn't happened that day, would any of us be sitting here seeing this truth now? What seemed like a personal outburst had become the first light shining on a wall left untouched for far too long. An act once viewed as crossing the line has now exposed a system that had fed on fear, complicity, and the silence of those who believed they had no right to speak. The press conference ended without applause, but within hours, hundreds of tweets and dozens of video clips from the presentation began circulating online. Lena's name was mentioned not just as a police chief, but as the first person to use the system's own power to reveal its true face. And even though some still called her a traitor to the force, thousands of others, those who had been wrongly arrested, beaten with no cameras, who had filed complaints that were never answered, knew that someone had finally said their names out loud. The moment Lena Carter's press conference ended, Millstone felt on the verge of a new era, one where data, evidence, and truth could finally stand in the open. But less than 12 hours later, editors at no fewer than 7 regional independent news outlets began receiving strange emails. No gag orders, no legal threats, just one repeated phrase. We suggest temporarily removing content related to information not yet verified by the appropriate authority. A few local broadcasters received phone calls not from the Millstone Police Department, and certainly not from the city's press office. They were connected instead to representatives from the State Internal Affairs Liaison Office, an agency Lena, despite being the chief, had no jurisdiction over. These callers didn't threaten, but they spoke in a language familiar to media executives. Ensure content doesn't create confusion in a multi-ethnic community. Wait for official conclusions before assigning labels. Be careful not to turn an individual into a misguided symbol. It all sounded reasonable, but the real message was clear. Stop. Don't stir it further. By the next morning, posts referencing Lena's press briefing had been pulled from multiple platforms. Some were flagged as unverified information. Others were removed for violating community standards. When Millstone PD's communications team tried to request reinstatement, no platform gave a clear answer about who issued the takedowns. No name, no public account, only one signal. The system was responding, and not from the bottom. Everything came into focus when a staffer from the State Government Communications Office leaked an internal email. The sender? A deputy director of the State Security Office. The recipient? Lead press coordinator, district agencies. The message was a single line. Pause all disclosures related to Malik Mitchell. The Millstone investigation is not yet concluded. Letting the media shape perception first will set a dangerous precedent. The phrase dangerous precedent sent a chill down Lena. It confirmed what she had long suspected. Mitchell wasn't acting alone. He was a groomed asset, promoted, protected, and polished for the numbers he produced in service of something far bigger than himself. As Lena dug deeper, names the public had never heard began to surface. A former legal advisory chief who trained Mitchell at the State Police Academy in 2003 and later oversaw his accelerated promotion for rapid response performance, a federal inspector in charge of the Southeast District who signed off on 47 of Mitchell's arrests in under 6 months without reviewing pending complaints, a former deputy director from the city's Security Grant Office who once called Mitchell a model of civil discipline enforcement in a report to Congress. None of them directly committed violence, but all of them signed, endorsed, or stayed silent at the right moments. And now, they were silencing the city not with batons or commands, but with legal jargon, content moderation protocols, and administrative authority no one could question. Lena couldn't subpoena them. They weren't under her command. She couldn't call them to testify. They didn't work for her department. But she understood now. This was the real seat of power, the names that didn't need to show up, because their fingerprints lived in every structural crack. Mitchell was just the dirty finger. The rest was the hand that patted his back every time he got results. At first, Lena thought she was investigating a man, a rogue officer abusing power, falsifying records, harming civilians, finally facing justice. But the further she dug into layers of files, policy chains, and funding decisions bearing Mitchell's name, the more she understood. Mitchell wasn't the problem. He was the product. the final output of a formula that existed long before she joined the force. A formula that looked clinical on paper: reduce crime, increase efficiency, maintain public safety stats. But behind that was a warped logic. Whoever delivered the numbers stayed, no matter how. One report Lena accessed revealed that during Mitchell's peak years, 2014-2016, Millstone received nearly $11 million, 0 cents, in federal special grants, justified by sharp crime reduction in low-invites residential zones. Most of those reductions came from the East Side Task Force commanded by Mitchell. No one in financial oversight knew or cared that most of the arrests led to no charges, no evidence, no conviction. No one tracked the emotional, physical, or personal fallout left behind. The only thing that survived was the data. The data became performance. Performance became justification. And so, Mitchell survived every term, every audit, every restructuring. Lena once sat across from someone in the State Homeland Security Grant Coordination Office, hoping for help tracking suspicious budget flows. Instead, she was met with a soft smile and a warning. I'd advise you to watch your tone. You're touching the reason this city even has operational funding. If you want to keep your job, stop. It wasn't a threat. It was a fact. Mitchell had been a useful link, and useful links don't get cut until they break the whole chain. But the painful truth was, even after Lena pinpointed where that chain was flawed, the system didn't care. It didn't care about wrongful arrests or falsified reports. It only cared about one thing: who could replace Mitchell and still keep the numbers up. And if the answer was no one, then Mitchell still had value. One policy official even told Lena flat out, in a closed-door meeting, if you keep associating Mitchell's name with public disclosures, support funds will be frozen until an official conclusion is reached, and that process takes time. Lena knew this wasn't the procedure. It was the strategy, a stall tactic, a way to exhaust her, slow her down, push her out if she wanted to preserve the very system she once believed in. And the bitterest truth of all, that system had once been her home. She walked out of that meeting without looking back. The door shut behind her like glass, sealing her off from the rest of officialdom. She was no longer part of the inside. She was someone demanding answers from people who never expected to answer to anyone. Former colleagues began to keep their distance. Federal calls were suddenly canceled. Major newspapers, once praising her courage, now run neutral op-eds, stressing, Lena Carter is a bold voice, but her data needs further review. Aaron Carter was released on a Wednesday afternoon. No sirens, no cameras, no slogans. Just his mother waiting at the gate of the county jail, holding the worn jacket he'd worn during his first court appearance. When he stepped out, he didn't say a word. He simply hugged his mother for longer than any goodbye before. Not out of emotion, but because for the first time in his life, Aaron felt he was stepping out of something bigger than bars, a system that had once silenced him simply for standing in the wrong place. Back home, the kitchen was still the same, the scratched wooden table, the creaky chair that groaned whenever someone stood up. But that dinner wasn't like the others. Lena, after weeks of holding back, finally told everything, not as a sister, but as a woman who had survived a storm her family never knew was that massive. She told them about the anonymous letters, some quiet, some hateful, about meetings where she was spun around by the very co-workers who once greeted her warmly but now avoided her gaze, about reports that mysteriously vanished, only to resurface altered. She even mentioned the email warning her that what you're doing could disrupt emergency relief funding. The dinner table fell silent. Aaron's mother didn't ask questions, just poured more lemonade. And Aaron, the boy who was once yanked off his bike just for being near a robbery, picked at his greens, spinning his spoon in the bowl like weighing the universe in his palm. Then he looked up, voice low but firm. You know, I used to think I was the problem, the weight that dragged you down. But it turns out I was the reason you couldn't back out. That night, Aaron didn't sleep. He sat in his room with only a single yellow light on, opened his old laptop. He didn't fix his hair. He didn't write a script. He turned on the camera and stared straight into the lens, like he was looking into a mirror. "My name is Lena Carter," he began. "I'm the one you called a criminal. The one who was handcuffed not because of evidence, but because of my skin. The one whose sister you kicked in the middle of a courtroom." His voice didn't shake, didn't rise, but there was something in it that made you unable to look away. He laid it out plainly, from Mitchell's first grab to the way everyone stared when his sister was kicked, and no one stood up. I stayed silent. Back then, I was ashamed that I pulled her into this, but now I get it. I'm not staying quiet anymore. Not for revenge, but to defend what my sister stood up to protect. That no one should be hit just because they dared to stand up. The video was exactly 7 minutes long. No background music, no effects. But within 10 hours of posting, it had been shared over 70,000 times. No edits were needed. Just his words, flowing straight into the eyes and the hearts of those watching. In the comments, hundreds wrote, "I used to be you. We thought silence kept us safe. Not anymore. Lena isn't just your sister. She's a mirror for everyone being choked while no one's looking." Aaron didn't become a hero. He became a reminder that in every person who once stayed silent, there comes a moment when you can no longer bow your head. And sometimes resistance doesn't begin with shouting, but with a family dinner and one simple line, "I don't want to be quiet anymore." Aaron's video spread faster than any report Lena had ever released. No graphs, no charts, no data maps. Just the face of a young man, once arrested, without being properly questioned, once labeled without evidence, now looking straight into a lens. Speaking slowly, but with undeniable weight. "If the man who kicked my sister isn't in jail, then what are you teaching the next ones who wear the uniform?" What seemed like a statement of anger landed like a public indictment. Law students shared it, influencers quoted it, and most importantly, it landed in the inboxes of the district attorney's office, Millstone's mayor, and the state inspector general. For the first time during the investigation, the pressure didn't come from data. It came from the very people who once believed they had no voice. The media couldn't ignore it. This was no longer an assault case. It was a call from a citizen once ignored by the very court that was meant to hear him. Within 72 hours of the video's release, the DA's office was flooded with calls from city council members, parent groups, and local voters. A group of black veterans who had served in peacekeeping missions issued an open letter. "If the government can't protect someone kicked down in court, don't expect the public to believe in justice." The pressure didn't come from career activists, but from everyday people, nurses, teachers, drivers, mechanics, people who had once passed Mitchell without daring to meet his eyes. Now they were asking in unison, "He's still free. What lesson is that teaching anyone?" By day 3, the Millstone District Attorney's Office issued an official statement. Officer Malik Mitchell will be held in custody pending investigation into serious legal violations, including assault of a high-ranking official, abuse of authority, and unjustified civilian assault. No more evasive language, no more legal shields. Mitchell's name was in the headline, not as a protector of the law, but as a suspect. A copy of the detention order spread online, one that many thought would never exist. No press conference, no soft-spoken briefings, just a signature, an ink stamp, and a command: detain. When Mitchell was taken from his suburban home, where neighbors once greeted him each morning calling him boss, no one came to see him off. No flashing lights, just a white police car with the rear door open and 2 plain-clothes officers at his side. Mitchell stepped out in a wrinkled T-shirt, uncombed hair, and eyes avoiding the cameras. He said nothing, but this time the cameras weren't across the street or peeking from behind fences like when he was leading an inquiry. This time, the cameras were level, direct, recording the real face of a man who once thought he was untouchable. And in that frame, no one called him a symbol anymore. He was just a man in cuffs. And the system that once shielded him now had to sit on the other side and explain why it took so long to let him fall. Mitchell sat in interrogation room 2. It used to be where he'd played the lead. asking the questions, deciding whether someone showed signs of resistance or not. But today, he wore no badge, had no nameplate. The chair was the same, black plastic, cold metal legs, but the posture was different. Gone was the arrogant lean. Gone was the gaze that once dominated the room. He sat upright, hands flat on the table, just as he used to order others to do, but his fingertips trembled, and he couldn't stop it. White walls, one-way mirror, no coercion, no shouting, just a single question from the other side. Why didn't you report the incident at the trial? Mitchell licked his lips, a reflex. He looked down, as if flipping through the mental scripts he once used to slip through trouble. He used to be good at that. There was a time he built an arrest report solely from the words of a hazy witness. There were times when a phone call from him made the footage mysteriously glitch. But today no one handed him a list of prepared answers. No colleague was in the room to signal with a glance. Every word he had to own. And the truth was, after 20 years, he had never had to own a single word by himself. The investigator didn't repeat the question. They let time do its work. Mitchell rolled his shoulders, pretending to adjust his seat, but really just stalling. He began, but there was no second half. He turned toward the one-way mirror, the mirror that had once been his ally. Now it simply reflected the very thing people had once feared. A middle-aged man in a detention uniform, sweating at the brow, panic in his eyes. A man like any other, just not yet used to being seen from the other side of power. No one banged the table, no one threw paper, but the silence in that room weighed heavier than any noise. He had once used silence to intimidate. Now it gnawed at him. When he finally spoke again, his voice was unsteady. I didn't think it was that serious." That sentence, recorded and entered into the report, marked the beginning of the collapse, because the system he once represented and proudly defended had never forgiven anyone who misjudged the severity of an incident, not because of ethics, but because he had revealed one fatal truth. He could be wrong. The cameras kept rolling. Notes were still being taken, but now no one in the room was waiting for the right answer. They only needed to see one thing: Mitchell, the once untouchable officer, running out of words. And for the first time, he couldn't avoid anyone's eyes, not because someone held him back, but because no one stood with him anymore. By the third day of questioning, Mitchell had lost the composure he clung to at the start. His prison-issued shirt was wrinkled, his wrist showed scratches from banging the table's edge. He spoke less, avoided eye contact more, and every answer was followed by long pauses, like he was waiting for someone outside the room to answer for him. But no one walked in. No emergency calls from higher-ups, no quiet guidance from the coordinating unit. Then the first psychological blow landed. Mitchell's personal attorney submitted a withdrawal request. The notice, sent directly to the Office of Internal Review and Press Affairs, read simply, "Client has failed to provide necessary, truthful information." A polite sentence, but anyone in the field knew what it meant. Mitchell said nothing upon hearing it, but his eyes widened slightly and his hands clenched, not to resist, but as if trying to hold on to something slipping away. In less than 48 hours, more signs followed that the safety net around him was dissolving. A former commander, once pictured beside him at a rapid response team celebration, declined to appear as a character witness. A policy board member who had once described Mitchell as a strategic asset abruptly stepped down, citing health concerns. A state-level civil security director, seen front and center at Mitchell's 2017 medal ceremony, sent only 3 words to the press: "No comment," and so the silence spread. But the most telling signs weren't in the refusals, they were in the erasers. Emails once used to defend Mitchell quietly vanished from internal servers. Old reports were updated and dates were adjusted to reduce liability. A quote of praise from a 2019 command board meeting, once included in many internal PR briefs, was scrubbed from open archives. No one declared him innocent, but no one dared say he was guilty either. They all chose the same response: step back, quietly, strategically, carefully. They didn't want his shadow on them. not out of principle, but out of fear that their past praise might now serve as evidence against them. And so the mini-empire Mitchell had built through fear, flattery, and inflated accolades crumbled, not from a judge's sentence, but from a cascade of turned backs. In this system, loyalty only lasted as long as the protected remained useful, and Mitchell, with tired eyes, a sagging collar, and no believable lies left, was now nothing at all. The door to Eastwood Detention Center opened with the familiar clank of cold metal, but Mitchell was no longer walking in as a commanding officer. This time, he wore no uniform, carried no weapon, and no one called him sir. He kept his head down as he passed through security, his hands cuffed in front of his waist, the kind of restraint used for offenders with assault histories, designed for quick control in case of resistance. None of the guards spoke. One recognized him, paused for a beat, then resumed typing into the log as if he'd never seen the man before. Not everyone hated Mitchell, but no one was willing to stand up for him anymore. His presence, once a symbol of order, had become a splinter no one wanted to acknowledge. An older officer, who once handled staff complaints a decade ago, quietly turned away as Mitchell was escorted down Hall D, the unit reserved for inmates with prior abuse complaints. It was the same place Mitchell had once ordered a 17-year-old boy detained for threatening an officer, when all the boy had done was curse after being wrongly arrested. When he reached room 2A, Mitchell didn't need to ask. He recognized it. A small cell with an iron bed, an open toilet, and a high-mounted surveillance camera, installed years ago on his own authorization. In his memory, 3 men had once been locked up here for flimsy reasons. One slept drunk in a park, one walked into a private parking lot by mistake, and one lacked ID. All 3 were black. All 3 had reacted, and Mitchell had taken those reactions as justification for firm action. Now, he sat on that same bed. Cuff marks were still fresh on his wrists. Sweat was collecting at the nape of his neck. The air wasn't more suffocating than usual, but something felt different. He could no longer press a button and summon someone. He couldn't request a cell transfer. He couldn't say, "If you don't cooperate, I have the right to detain you." He was just another inmate, marked with a temporary ID number scribbled in marker on a paper tag pinned to his chest. No name, no rank, just a code. A guard brought him his first meal, a plastic tray with cold bread, canned beans, and a cup of water. Mitchell took the tray with both hands, stepped toward the dining table, and for the first time, had to wait in line like everyone else. No one confronted him. No one cursed, but no one made room either. He understood. No one here feared him anymore. And for the first time in his life, he was in a place where no door opened from his side. The first night passed without incident. No thrown food, no fights. But Mitchell couldn't sleep. Not because of the cold fluorescent light overhead, or the footsteps of the guards pacing hourly. It was because of the one thing he couldn't control: the eyes from across the bars. Every time he looked up, someone from the opposite block was watching him, not speaking, not calling, just watching, and in their gaze he saw fear, but not the kind he once commanded. It was disdain, tinged with satisfaction, from those once oppressed, now seeing the oppressor in chains. The next morning, assigned to clean the common area, as all new inmates were, Mitchell passed a row of cells holding about 8 men. One middle-aged black man, solidly built, leaned his elbows on the bars and stared directly at him. No smile, no wink, just one sentence, delivered in a hoarse, low voice. "I remember your elbow in 88 King Street." Mitchell paused for less than half a second, but his heart clenched. He didn't need to ask if it was true. He didn't remember every name, but he remembered that he'd never cared to learn them, and now they remembered his. No records needed, no footage. They remembered the kicks, the stares, the times he forced confessions with threats of solitary. The memories he'd dismissed as part of the job now returned in every pair of eyes he couldn't avoid. No one hit him, but no one protected him either. To the guards, he was a special inmate, not for privilege but for containment. They knew if someone retaliated against Mitchell, the whole facility could fall under federal review. So the safest move was to isolate him. Mitchell ate alone, worked out alone. No one spoke to him, but no one ignored him either. He existed under constant watch, living in the middle of a quiet triangle of hatred, contempt, and delayed justice. One young Latino inmate whispered to his bunkmate as Mitchell passed, "Yo, that's Mitchell. Thought he'd be older. Turns out he shakes like the rest of them." And that was what Mitchell wasn't used to, not being feared. When fear vanished, everything he'd built collapsed. Every order shouted into a radio, every handshake in a boardroom, all had depended on one thing: fear. Now he was receiving exactly what he had created, but from the other side. No more bowed heads, just eyes across the bars. Those who had never been allowed to look straight at him, now standing still, looking as if to say, "Finally, it's your turn." After Mitchell's arrest, many believed the story had reached its end, but Lena knew better. If it ended with just one name, then his shadow still remained. No one manipulates an entire system unless that system allows it. She began where most wrongful cases had been buried, the civil complaints that had been dismissed. She requested that the Law Enforcement Records Division provide all civilian complaint files from the past 15 years, especially those marked insufficient grounds for further investigation. Over 1,200 cases were delivered to her office, most filed by people of color, the homeless, minors, or undocumented immigrants. Each form was a story that had once been crossed out. Some complaints were under 3 lines. Others were dismissed for reasons as trivial as missing a third-party signature. Lena didn't see this as a system error. She called it selective enforcement, where the law only works for those whose voices are louder than their pain. Instead of forwarding them to Internal Affairs, she formed an independent review unit, entirely non-uniformed. It included former public defenders, a university professor specializing in racial data analysis, a community organizer wrongfully arrested in 2009, and most notably, a young man named Cole, whose teeth had been knocked out but was coerced into signing a charge for resisting arrest. Cole was the first person Lena called, not to apologize, but to give him back the right to see the file that once erased him. "You don't need anyone's forgiveness," she told him. "You need to know what happened." From their side, the team was called Review from the Root, not Reform, not Restoring Trust. Lena deliberately avoided PR-friendly phrases. The goal wasn't to beautify the system. It was to open each file, see who ignored it, who stayed silent, and who got promoted by brushing it aside. Each case was tagged by timeline, context, and authority level. A transparent tracking system was integrated, and any party involved could check who was reviewing their file, at what stage, and awaiting response from which level. When the first case was re-examined, a man arrested for vehicle theft intent while asleep in his own car, Lena asked the behavioral analysis team why it had never been investigated. Their answer chilled the room. No surveillance footage. So command deemed it insufficient. The arresting officer had a strong track record. That was the unspoken formula the system had long relied on. Suspicion plus no evidence plus high-performing officer equals discarded file. From that point, data maps were rebuilt. Lena published real-time indicators of zones with unusually high complaint dismissal rates. Residents were invited to submit feedback if they had been denied case reviews in those areas. Within 2 weeks, 236 responses arrived. Some names matched past complaints against Mitchell, but Lena refused to let the investigation fall into the same old loop. She set a rule. Every discovery must ask not only who violated policy, but who approved it, who stayed silent. The point wasn't to punish the past, but to ensure the new system didn't grow from the same rot. There were no rewards, no press announcements, just a single line posted to the city's website. If you once filed a complaint and never received an answer, You now have the right to request its review, and we are obligated to respond. No lawyer needed. For the first time in over a decade, the word justice in Millstone stood without a symbol. No armor, no badge, no emblem. Just someone once forgotten, now called by name. Once that door was open, Lena refused to let it close. With each re-examined case, she wasn't just seeking truth, she was rebuilding trust. To Lena, justice wasn't about punishing one wrongdoer. It was about creating a system clear enough that no one had to suffer in silence. To do that, she had to do what the old system never had, trace the mechanism backward. She requested access to all officer behavior evaluations from 2007 onward, specifically those with positive review that coincided with dismissed complaints. The results were telling. Dozens of officers were promoted for meeting arrest quotas in high crime zones that perfectly overlapped with known abuse clusters. In one case, an officer was praised for maintaining order in residential areas. Despite 15 complaints filed in that neighborhood in the same year, all dismissed as unsubstantiated, Lena didn't release those names to the press. She submitted them to the Independent Oversight Board and asked for a cross-investigation. Who approved the promotions? Who rejected the complaints? Was there any benefit shared between those sides? Those questions used to be taboo. Everyone knew them, but no one dared ask. Now, they were pinned to the board like any other public metric. Every time the Oversight Board found a conflict, Lena instructed, "Mark this file in red so anyone entering the force will see the trace of a system that once failed without accountability." No one was fired immediately. There was no purge. Lena didn't need to appear heavy-handed. What she needed was a new doorway, where anyone stepping in understood that every footprint would be recorded. She began building an anonymous civilian feedback system. After each police interaction, citizens could rate their experience via encrypted code. An AI would track recurring behavior. If an officer received 3 or more negative reports within 6 months with no positive feedback, the case would be forwarded to oversight, and crucially, the officer would be required to submit a written explanation to the complainant. A small mechanism, but it reshaped enforcement culture. Officers began to understand it wasn't enough to be right. They had to explain why they believed they were right. And if they were wrong, they couldn't hide behind orders, protocol, or situational response. They had to answer with their real name, real signature, to a real person. Lena also launched an open data portal. All civilian feedback, encrypted and analyzed, would be made public monthly. Anyone, from citizens to researchers, could download, chart, and detect patterns. A statistics student at Millstone University wrote to Lena, thanking her because the data helped her complete a thesis on organizational behavior. That wasn't Lena's goal, but it proved something. When justice is recorded clearly, it can grow in ways power never anticipates. And in the end, Lena attached her name to none of it. Review from the root had no logo, no slogan, no director, because Lena believed anywhere that needs a face to represent justice, it still doesn't understand what justice truly is. She left only one line in the internal manual. Every case once closed is now the door through which we ask what we've learned from the silence that used to answer back. Millstone used to be a name that, when mentioned, made people either shake their heads or quickly change the subject. A small city, known not for achievements but for its silence. Silence when a teenager was wrongly arrested. Silence when complaints went unanswered. Silence when videos lost original data. And most frightening of all, silence even when someone dared to speak up. That's why the Mitchell case didn't initially shock residents the way outsiders expected. And in Millstone, a police officer kicking a black woman in court, while serious, wasn't exactly a surprise, because the people there had already endured years of invisible kicks, judgment, dismissal, exclusion, and indifference. Then, something unexpected happened. Instead of covering up and moving on, Millstone chose to look inward, not with a media campaign, not with a flashy press conference, but by changing things at the root. The root reassessment system, launched by Lena Carter, didn't just reopen old complaints. It forced the entire justice apparatus to answer from the beginning. Why was a case shelved? Who had the authority to alter data? And if misconduct was found, who was held accountable, even if the case was closed 10 years ago? These weren't easy questions. But by not avoiding them, Millstone began to be seen differently. It was no longer Mitchell's city. It became the first place to allow real-time public access to law enforcement records, live citizen feedback on any police interaction, and written responses from an independent oversight team. Now, every internal meeting includes a seat reserved for a community representative, someone without a badge, not on payroll, and with the power to delay decisions if transparency isn't met. Civilian complaints are no longer pre-screened by HR. Every report from the public, even something as subtle as a hostile glance from an officer, is logged as behavioral data. What used to be considered not worth investigating is now tracked as an early indicator of potential abuse. But what truly reshaped Millstone wasn't the tech or the procedures, it was the way the city owned its past. When the list of 47 cases previously dismissed under Mitchell's command was published, officials didn't call it a procedural error. They posted it clearly on the public site. We were wrong, and we are fixing it, case by case. That honesty changed the narrative. News outlets that once called Millstone a hot spot of enforcement manipulation began using the phrase, "a brave city of reform," and in legal forums, law students started referencing Millstone to make a point. Systems don't change by replacing people, but by rewriting the questions they're built on. Lena didn't take the stage at the reform summits. Instead, she stepped back, passing the spotlight to independent task forces and former victims turned investigative advisors. There were no reform ambassadors, no slogans plastered across town, just a quiet line on the city's official banner. We are not a model. We are proof that a place once broken can fix itself. And that's why the nation started looking back at Millstone, not to applaud, but to learn. A city once dismissed as a justice wasteland had become evidence that silence, when confronted, can be transformed into voice. And when that happens, the right thing no longer needs a leader. It walks out on its own. At first, no one believed that a small city like Millstone could have any meaningful influence. It had no global profile, no major media budget, and no high-profile political names attached. But what Millstone had was real data, real people, and real results. That's why, within 3 months, the work of Lena Carter and the independent task force began drawing attention nationwide. The city of Seattle sent a formal request to share Millstone's law enforcement feedback protocol. Sacramento held an emergency hearing where Millstone was mentioned 14 times, not for scandal, but for doing what larger systems haven't dared: giving citizens the right to access police behavior records. What began as a simple case audit process evolved into a recognized precedent. It didn't just reopen closed cases. It required every investigator to explain in plain language how those cases had been handled. No more sterile legal phrases like "no procedural violation found." In Millstone, every reply came with a promise. If a mistake was made, the person ignored would be called back by their name at the right time with the role they deserved in the justice system. In Chicago, a judicial reform summit hosted a full panel on the Millstone model. No city officials attended. Lena declined the invitation. But the coordination team released all materials as open source so any department could download, adapt, and apply it for almost zero cost. During the session, a facilitator from Detroit said, "What we need isn't a blueprint. We need proof that this can work and not fall apart." Millstone had delivered that proof. Civil rights groups in New Orleans and Pittsburgh began comparing their arrest data to Millstone's behavioral tracking templates. They found that if the same analysis were applied, over 17% of arrests in those cities would warrant reinvestigation. That wasn't a small number, and it wasn't a coincidence. It showed that a transparent system, built by those with nothing to gain from the outcome, will always reveal what insiders have learned to ignore. The most remarkable thing about Millstone's influence was its lack of spectacle. There was no media blitz called the Millstone model, no ads, no hashtags, but human rights groups, legal scholars, data activists, and even those once harmed by misconduct quietly shared the city's name among themselves as a breadcrumb trail to hope. A nonprofit in Texas wrote, "We don't ask anyone to copy Millstone, but if you're not doing at least what they've done, then we'll keep paying the price through the silence of the harmed." In the end, what spread fastest wasn't the model itself, it was the idea behind it, that justice doesn't start in the courtroom. It starts with the willingness to admit you were wrong. In a world full of systems eager to erase mistakes and start fresh, Millstone chose to keep the errors visible so that every step forward would actually mean something. That's the kind of truth that needs no PR team to be heard. After the final report was released by the Independent Oversight Committee, Lena's inbox overflowed with invitations, national television shows, law reform panels, front-page interviews, even a letter from the state governor inviting her to accept the Civilian Honor Medal. One journalist called urgently. "You're the kind of role model this country needs to hear from." Lena didn't get angry. She simply gave the same answer she had before. "I didn't do this for applause." She didn't need her name turned into a hashtag. She didn't want her face on a magazine cover labeled "The Woman Who Changed Millstone." To her, what had happened wasn't a triumph. It was what needed to be done when no one else would do it. When a community has been silenced for too long, breaking that silence isn't heroism. It's duty. A documentary team once sent her a pre-cut trailer, Lena standing before the courthouse, backlit dramatically, a voiceover declaring, "The woman who stood alone against the system." Lena quietly replied by email, just one line, "I was never alone, and I never wanted to fight." This journey, for her, was never about admiration. She didn't want to be turned into a symbol, only to be used later as a shield behind which the system could hide and say, "Look, we've changed." She didn't need that. She didn't do any of this to be loved. She did it because it needed to be done, because it was right. Lena still showed up at work every morning, on time. She had lunch with the coordination unit, reviewed every civil complaint late at night, quietly, just as she had stepped into that courtroom on her first day. No announcement, no introduction, no noise. The public still spoke her name, but she didn't step forward to respond. She left the final word to those who once believed they were nobody and now were called by name. Justice, to Lena, had never been a stage or a trophy. It was something that should simply happen. And when people grow too used to injustice, choosing to do what is right, quietly, steadily, without applause, is sometimes the most courageous act of all. A special session of the Millstone City Council took place on a Monday morning. On the table were proposals for a new city flag, what the mayor called a symbol for a new era of rebuilding. 3 large polished designs were presented: a stylized lamp of justice, a closed circle representing community and law, and a judge's gavel over a field of blue. All were sent to Lena's office with a gentle request. "As the representative of reform, we ask for your final input." Lena didn't respond immediately. She printed each design, laid them out on her desk, looked at them for a long time, then folded them away. She handwrote a note and sent it through internal mail. "Let the flag have no symbol, no logo, no text, just a gray-white field, like the case files whose ink had faded." The answer startled the council. One member asked aloud, "But if there's nothing, what will people remember?" And it was that question that told Lena everything. They were still looking for something easy to display, easy to brand, easy to put on a poster, rather than the harder thing, to remember why the flag had to exist at all. For her, no symbol, no matter how noble, could replace the forgotten truth. A system that once ignored victims, distorted evidence, and turned kicks like Mitchell's into riot protocol didn't deserve to be cleansed with a new design. It needed emptiness, so that everyone had to look at it and face it, not someone else, themselves. When the city agreed to Lena's proposal, the new flag was raised on the morning of November 2nd. No ceremony, no speeches, no ribbon to cut. Just a city clerk in plain office clothes, slowly raising the flag over Millstone City Hall. Beneath the autumn sky, a square of gray-white fabric fluttered gently. No emblem, no slogan. People watched, no one clapped, but no one asked why the flag was blank, because they knew anyone who had lived here long enough, who had heard the names long forgotten, who had seen unjust trials, understood. That empty space was a reminder, a silence that had once been buried. Lena wasn't there that day. She was still at the station, processing the final rounds of civilian feedback reviews. A young colleague ran up to show her a live stream of the flag raising. She glanced at the screen, then nodded, not to approve it, but to remind herself, not every ending needs a round of applause. Sometimes the right thing to do is to step out of the frame and let what remains be seen, without anyone having to explain it. A city doesn't need another hero. It needs to rebuild the ground so that every citizen, badge or no badge, title or none, can believe, if I fall, someone will call my name and help me up. The space in Interrogation Room 4 looked exactly the same. Pale gray walls, an exposed bulb ceiling light with visible wires, a high mountain corner camera, one cold metal table, two chairs facing each other, and a one-way mirror spanning the right wall. Mitchell had sat here before, but on the other side, the side of question, the side of authority, the side where a slight lean forward could make the person across the table panic and stumble over their own words. But today, he was the one being watched. No folder lay in front of him, no nameplate, no badge, no crisp uniform, just a clear plastic cup of water, a faint sweat on his brow, and hands pressed firmly to the tabletop, trying not to shake. No one entered the room. No officer sat across from him as per the old procedure. But Mitchell knew someone was behind the mirror, someone watching, someone listening. He didn't sense it, he recognized it. And then a voice came through, clear, not loud, not cold, and needing no force. You have no authority now, no uniform. So who are you, really? Mitchell closed his eyes briefly. He knew that voice. No name was given, no intro needed, but he knew. It was Lena, the woman he once thought would drown in her own defiance, the woman he had kicked to the floor in court, the woman he dismissed as just another face of resistance. Now it was her voice, posing a question he never imagined he'd have to answer. He stared straight into the mirror, saw no one, only himself, a face older than his age, eyes that could no longer look away, and he answered, not as a statement, not as a defense, but like someone with nothing left to protect. I used to think if I held the law tight, punished fast, I'd be called someone who keeps order. He paused, eyes unblinking. But all I learned was how to make people afraid. I never learned how to make them feel safe. No one responded from behind the glass. No pen tapping, no scribbling notes, but the silence felt more real than any interrogation had before. He exhaled, slowly. He didn't say, I'm sorry. He understood some wrongs couldn't be erased by those words, but for the first time in over 20 years of wearing a badge, he wasn't trying to prove he was right. He didn't ask for sympathy. He simply sat there, with a face stripped of all armor. And that mirror, cold and impassive, had become the only thing showing him who he really was. A man who had gone too far, not because no one stopped him, but because he never stopped himself from asking what he was becoming. Lena's question, seemingly simple, kept echoing in his head. You have no authority now, no uniform. So who are you, really? He had no full answer. But maybe, for the first time, he knew how to begin finding it. Not through records, not through orders, not through rank, but through the growing emptiness that now filled the space where accolades and protection once stood. The conversation didn't last long. No official transcript, no recording. But between them, Mitchell and Lena, there was a silence so heavy that every word carried a weight it never had before. After uttering the line even he couldn't believe had come from his own mouth, "I never learned how to make people feel safe," he said nothing. Lena, from the other side of the mirror, didn't press on. She let the silence linger, as if giving him time to find the rest of the answer himself. Then, quietly, he asked, his voice softer than ever before, "Were you ever afraid choosing this path?" His tone held no sarcasm, no defense. Just a genuine question from someone who had once believed he was untouchable, now realizing there were people who faced justice without power and never flinched. From the other side, Lena answered calmly, "Yes, I was afraid of being called radical. I was afraid of being wrong. But what I feared most was becoming silent, just like you once hoped others would be." Her words weren't aimed at Mitchell. They felt more like a bell rung between two people, each representing a side of history. One who had relied on being feared. One who had learned to stand tall even when standing alone. Mitchell nodded. No excuses, no rebuttals. He sat in silence, brushing his fingers against the cuff marks, still faint on his wrists from days before. Then, looking straight into the mirror again for the second time, he asked, "Do you think someone like me could start over somewhere?" It wasn't a plea. It wasn't for forgiveness. It was the tentative reach of someone who had lost everything, trying for the first time to imagine something beyond power, something closer to personal worth. Lena didn't return to the room, but she answered, as if placing the words exactly where they belonged. "I don't know where you'll begin again, but I know no one is born with a badge for life, and no one is meant to live forever inside the things they once did wrong, if they're brave enough to name them for what they were." Mitchell closed his eyes. A single drop, unclear whether sweat or tear, fell to his hand. He didn't wipe it away. Didn't flinch. Just sat there in silence. A man who once commanded hundreds of case files now finds himself named in one for the first time. Their story didn't end with forgiveness, nor was it the kind of reconciliation that made headlines. Lena left the monitoring room shortly after. Mitchell was led back to his cell, uncuffed but without farewell. What remained was a final question that lingered in both their minds. If there's no badge, no title, who are we, really? And from that, each began the next chapter. No longer as adversaries, no longer needing applause. Just two people taking steps toward truth, where justice no longer looked like punishment, but like the chance to begin again, if one dares to face the thing they've avoided most, themselves.